The morning air at Windsor Castle was cold and sharp. Mist hung low over the royal stables, where 30 horses stood in their stalls, each one worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. But one horse was different. One horse belonged to the Queen herself. Sergeant Marcus Webb had been a royal guard for 12 years. He knew every rule, every protocol, every line that could never be crossed. And on this particular morning, he was about to face the hardest decision of his career. It started with a phone call to the stable master, then whispers among the staff, then finally the order came down from above. Queen Camilla wanted something. Something that had never been asked for before. She wanted the late Queen Elizabeth's personal horse prepared for her son, Tom Parker Bowles. Not for a ceremony, not for a photograph. For a casual morning ride through the royal grounds. The stable master's face went pale when he heard it. The younger guards looked at each other nervously. Everyone knew what this horse meant. It wasn't just an animal. It was a living memory of a woman the entire nation had mourned just months before. If you're feeling the tension already, hit that subscribe button because this story only gets more intense from here. Marcus stood in front of Noble Spirit's stall. The horse was magnificent. 17 hands high, coat like polished mahogany, eyes that seemed almost human. The Queen had ridden this horse every week for 5 years. She had fed him apples from her hand. She had whispered to him in the early mornings when no one else was around. Now he stood alone, waiting, as if he still expected her to return. The stable master approached Marcus quietly. His voice was low, almost apologetic. "Orders are orders, Sergeant. The horse needs to be saddled and ready in 20 minutes. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. He had stood at attention during the Queen's funeral. He had watched the coffin pass. He had seen the nation weep. And now, barely 6 months later, as the King approved this? Marcus asked carefully. The stable master hesitated. The request came from Queen Camilla's office. That's all I know. Marcus looked back at Noble Spirit. The horse was calm, but there was something in his posture. A tension, as if he too could sense that something was wrong. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Marcus didn't move. He stood at the stall door, his hand resting on the latch, but he didn't open it. Other guards watched from a distance. No one spoke. Everyone understood what was happening, even if no one said it out loud. Then footsteps echoed through the stable. Sharp, purposeful, getting closer. A royal aide appeared, dressed in formal attire, clipboard in hand. Behind him, casual and relaxed, was Tom Parker Bowles. He wore riding boots and a confident smile, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. "Is the horse ready?" the aide asked, his voice clipped and impatient. Marcus stood perfectly still. His uniform was spotless. His posture was rigid, but his hand remained on the latch, unmoving. "Sergeant Webb," the aide said, more firmly this time. "The horse now." Marcus looked at Tom, then at the aide, then back at Noble Spirit. The horse's ears flicked back, listening, waiting, and in that moment, Marcus made a choice that would change everything. "Asterisk, I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. "I cannot prepare this horse." The words hung in the air like smoke. The aide's face turned red. Tom Parker Bowles stopped smiling. From somewhere in the back of the stable, a horse whinnied softly, as if sensing the tension. "Excuse me." The aide stepped forward, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Did you just refuse a direct order?" Marcus kept his eyes forward, his voice steady. "This horse belonged to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. He has not been ridden since her passing. I don't believe it's appropriate to use him for recreational purposes without proper consultation." He wasn't a cruel man. He hadn't asked for this to become a confrontation. But the aide wasn't backing down. "Sergeant Webb, you are a royal guard, not a policymaker. You follow orders? The horse is royal property, and Queen Camilla has every right to decide how it's used." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Every instinct told him to obey, to step aside, to let them take the horse and save his career. But something deeper, something he couldn't name, kept him rooted in place. "With respect, sir, I'm asking that this decision be reviewed by the king's office first." The aide's eyes narrowed. "The king is in Scotland on business. This is not a matter that requires his personal attention. Now step aside, or I will have you removed from duty." The stable had gone completely silent. Every worker, every guard, every groom was frozen, watching. This wasn't just about a horse anymore. This was about respect. About memory. About what the royal family stood for. Marcus looked at Tom directly for the first time. "Mr. Parker Bowles, with respect, there are 29 other horses in this stable. Any one of them would be honored to carry you this morning. But this one is special." Tom opened his mouth, then closed it. For a brief moment, something passed across his face. Understanding, maybe, or guilt. But before he could speak, the aide cut in. "Sergeant, you have 10 seconds to open that stall, or you will be escorted off royal grounds and relieved of your position. Do you understand?" Marcus's heart pounded. 12 years of service. A clean record. A career he had built with pride and discipline. All of it about to end because of one choice. He thought about the Queen. Not Queen Camilla. The other one. The one who had dedicated 70 years of her life to duty. The one who had never asked for anything but respect and loyalty from those who served her. And he thought about noble spirit. Standing alone in his stall, waiting for a rider who would never come. "I understand, sir," Marcus said quietly, "but my answer remains the same." The aide's face went from red to purple. He spun toward the other guards. "Someone get this man out of here, and saddle that horse immediately." 2 younger guards stepped forward hesitantly. They looked at Marcus with apologetic eyes, but they had families to feed, careers to protect. Marcus didn't blame them. He stepped aside, his hands at his sides. But then something unexpected happened. One of the guards stopped. His name was James. He was 24 years old, fresh out of training. He looked at Marcus, then at the horse, then back at the aide. "Sir," James said, his voice shaking slightly, I don't feel comfortable doing this either." The aide's mouth fell open. "What?" Another guard, an older woman named Catherine, stepped forward. "Nor I, sir." One by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, the guards stepped back. None of them spoke. None of them made a grand gesture. They simply stood still, their eyes forward, their hands at their sides. The aide looked around in disbelief. He turned to Tom, who was staring at the ground, his face unreadable. "This is mutiny," the aide hissed. "This is insubordination. You will all be dismissed." Marcus felt a strange calm wash over him. He had expected to stand alone. He had been prepared to lose everything by himself. But now, surrounded by his fellow guards, he realized something important. He wasn't alone, and neither was the memory of the Queen they had all sworn to serve. The aide pulled out his phone with trembling hands. His voice was low and sharp as he spoke to whoever was on the other end. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but he could see the fury in every gesture. Every sharp movement, Tom Parker Bowles finally spoke. "Look, maybe we should just use a different horse. This isn't worth all this trouble." But the aide shook his head violently. "This isn't about the horse anymore. This is about authority. About respect for the royal family." Tom looked uncomfortable. "My mother wouldn't want this kind of scene. Let's just forget it." "Your mother gave a clear instruction," the aide snapped. "And these guards are refusing to follow it. That cannot be ignored." Marcus watched Tom's face carefully. He saw the conflict there. Tom wasn't a bad person. He was caught in the middle of something he hadn't asked for, something that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Behind them, noble spirit shifted in his stall. His ears were back now, his eyes wide. Horses could sense human emotion. And the tension in this stable was thick enough to choke on. The aide finished his phone call and turned back to the group. His expression was cold, calculated. "Security's on their way. You will all be suspended pending an investigation. Your badges will be collected, and you will leave the grounds immediately." Catherine, the older guard, spoke up. Her voice was steady, but there was emotion beneath it. "Sir, with respect, We're not trying to cause trouble. We're trying to honor someone who gave her entire life to this country." "The late Queen would have wanted you to follow orders," the aide shot back. "The late Queen would have wanted us to use our judgment," Marcus replied quietly. "She trusted us to make the right decisions, even when they were difficult." The aide stepped closer to Marcus, his face inches away. "You don't speak for the Queen. You're a guard, a servant. You do what you're told." Marcus didn't flinch. "I was a servant to Queen Elizabeth for 12 years. I stood outside her door in the rain. I escorted her through crowds. I would have taken a bullet for her without hesitation. And I will not dishonor her memory now." Footsteps echoed through the stable entrance. Heavy boots on stone. Security was arriving. Marcus could see the younger guards starting to panic. James looked like he might be sick. Catherine closed her eyes briefly, as if praying, but then a different sound cut through the tension. A car door slamming, heels clicking rapidly across the courtyard, and a voice, sharp and commanding, calling out, "Stop! Everyone stop!" The aide turned and his face went pale. Marcus looked toward the entrance and saw a woman striding toward them. She was in her 60s, dressed in a perfectly tailored coat, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her expression was thunderous. It was Lady Margaret Hartley, the Queen's former private secretary. She had retired just weeks after the funeral, too heartbroken to continue. But she still had connections. She still had power. "What in God's name is happening here?" Lady Margaret demanded, her eyes sweeping across the scene. The aide straightened, trying to regain his composure. "Lady Hartley, this is a private matter involving insubordinate staff. I know exactly what this is," she cut him off. "I received a call from someone in the stable, and I came immediately because I knew this would happen eventually." She walked past the aide without looking at him and stopped in front of Noble Spirit's stall. The horse's ears perked up. He recognized her. She had accompanied the Queen on many of her visits to the stable. Lady Margaret reached through the bars and touched the horse's nose gently. Noble Spirit leaned into her hand, and for just a moment, the tension in the air seemed to ease. "This horse," Lady Margaret said quietly, "was not just a pet. He was Her Majesty's confidant. Her companion in the early mornings when the weight of the crown became too heavy. She loved this animal." She turned to face the aide, and her expression hardened. "And you thought it appropriate to hand him over for a casual ride barely 6 months after her death." The aide opened his mouth, but no words came out. Lady Margaret looked at Tom. "Mr. Parker Bowles, I know you. You're a kind man. You didn't ask for this controversy, but your mother made a mistake, and you have the power to correct it right now." Tom looked at the horse, then at the guards, then at the aide. He took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "She's right," he said. "This was a bad idea. I don't need this horse. I don't want this horse. Let's just end this." The aide looked furious, but he was outranked, and he knew it. Lady Margaret turned to Marcus and the other guards. Her eyes were soft now, almost tearful. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for remembering what matters." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. He had been prepared to lose everything, but instead, he had protected something that couldn't be replaced. But this story wasn't over yet. The security team arrived moments later, but Lady Margaret waved them off with a single gesture. The aide looked like he wanted to argue, but one glare from her silenced him completely. Tom Parker Bowles left quietly, his head down, clearly relieved to escape the situation. But as the crowd dispersed, Lady Margaret pulled Marcus aside. Her voice was low, meant only for him. "You know this isn't over, don't you?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I know. Queen Camilla will hear about this, and she won't be pleased that her wishes were denied." Lady Margaret's eyes were serious. "You made the right choice today, but the right choice often comes with consequences." Marcus had already accepted that. He had thrown away his career for a horse. Some people would call him a fool. Some would call him a hero, but titles didn't matter to him. He had done what his conscience demanded, and that was enough. Lady Margaret surprised him by placing a hand on his shoulder. "Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth would have been proud of you. I want you to know that." Those words meant more to Marcus than any medal or commendation ever could. The next 48 hours were brutal. The story leaked to the press. Headlines exploded across every newspaper and website. Guard refuses Queen Camilla's orders. Royal horse scandal. Rebellion at Windsor Castle. The public response was immediate and divided. Some people praised Marcus as a hero, defending the late queen's memory. Others condemned him as insubordinate and disrespectful to the new royal family. Social media erupted into heated debates. Hashtags trended. Everyone had an opinion. Marcus was suspended, as expected. He was told to remain home while an internal investigation took place. The other guards who had stood with him were also suspended. James called Marcus that night, his voice shaking with worry about losing his job. Catherine sent a text saying she didn't regret her choice, but her family was upset. Marcus sat in his small apartment, watching the news coverage with a strange sense of detachment. This had become so much bigger than he ever intended. All he wanted was to protect one horse. Now the entire nation was talking about duty, loyalty, and the future of the monarchy. His phone rang constantly. Journalists wanting interviews, friends asking if he was okay, his mother calling to say she was proud, even though she was clearly worried sick. But one call stood out. It came on the third day. An unknown number. Marcus almost didn't answer. Sergeant Webb? The voice was formal, controlled. "This is Private Secretary to His Majesty the King. The King would like to speak with you. Can you be at Buckingham Palace tomorrow morning at 9? Marcus's heart stopped. This was it. The final judgment. King Charles himself was going to weigh in on what had happened. "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "I'll be there." That night, Marcus barely slept. He replayed everything in his mind. The moment he refused, the look on the aide's face, the other guard stepping forward. Had he done the right thing? Or had he let his emotions override his duty? By morning, he still didn't have an answer. Buckingham Palace was imposing in the early light. Marcus wore his dress uniform, pressed and perfect. He was escorted through hallways lined with portraits of kings and queens stretching back centuries. Each face seemed to judge him as he passed. Finally, he was led into a private sitting room. It was smaller than he expected, more intimate. There were family photographs on the side tables, books stacked on a desk. It felt lived in real. And then King Charles entered. Marcus stood at attention immediately, his heart hammering. The king looked tired. There were lines on his face that hadn't been there a year ago. The weight of the crown had already begun to show. "Sergeant Webb," the king said, his voice measured. "Please, sit." Marcus sat, though every instinct told him to remain standing. The king took a chair across from him, not behind a desk, but face to face. Equal somehow, despite the vast difference in their stations. "I've read the reports," the king began. "I've heard from multiple parties, and I've thought very carefully about this situation." Marcus waited, his hands folded in his lap, his breathing steady, despite the storm inside him. "My mother loved that horse," the king continued, and there was emotion in his voice now. "She spoke about him often. He brought her peace in difficult times. When I heard what had been requested," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was not consulted. Had I been, I would not have approved." Relief flooded through Marcus, but he kept his expression neutral. The king leaned forward slightly. "But that isn't the full issue here, is it? The issue is that you, a guard, refused a direct order from a member of the royal family. That sets a dangerous precedent." And just like that, the relief vanished. "However," the king said, and that one word changed everything. "However," the king repeated, his eyes meeting Marcus's directly. "There is a difference between blind obedience and thoughtful service. My mother understood that. She valued people who could think for themselves, who could recognize when something was wrong, even if it meant standing alone." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected this. He had prepared himself for dismissal, for disgrace, not for understanding. "You put your career at risk for a principle," the king continued. "For respect, for memory. Those are not qualities I want to punish. Those are qualities I want in the people who serve this family. The king stood, and Marcus immediately rose as well. They stood facing each other, and for a moment, Marcus saw not a king, but a son still mourning his mother. "Your suspension is lifted," the king said firmly. "You and the guards who stood with you will return to duty. There will be a formal note in your files acknowledging what happened, but it will be framed as a commendation for dedication to duty, not a reprimand." Marcus's chest felt tight. "Your Majesty," the king raised a hand gently. "There's more. I'm issuing a private directive that Noble Spirit is to be retired from any active use. He will live out his remaining years in peace at Windsor, cared for by the royal stable, but never ridden again. He was my mother's horse, and he will remain hers, even now." Tears burned at the corners of Marcus's eyes, but he fought them back. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know." The king nodded, then did something unexpected. He extended his hand, not as a king to a subject, but as one man to another. Marcus shook it, feeling the strength in that grip, the gratitude. "My wife made a request without understanding its significance," the king said quietly. "She has been informed of my decision, and she accepts it. But Sergeant Webb, I need you to understand something. This family is navigating difficult waters. Change is hard. Transition is hard. There will be more conflicts like this. More moments where the old ways clash with the new. I understand, Your Majesty. Hope you'll continue to serve with the same integrity you showed 3 days ago. Even when it's difficult. Even when it costs you always, sir." The king smiled, a small, sad smile. "My mother chose her people well. Thank you for proving that." Marcus left Buckingham Palace feeling lighter than he had in days. The weight hadn't fully lifted. He knew there would still be awkward conversations. Still be people who resented what he'd done, but the most important judgment had been made. When he returned to Windsor Castle, the other guards greeted him quietly. James gripped his shoulder with obvious relief. Catherine gave him a rare smile. The stable master shook his hand without a word, but the respect in his eyes said everything. Marcus walked to Noble Spirit's stall. The horse stood in the afternoon light, calm and regal. When Marcus approached, Noble Spirit turned his head and looked at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. "You're safe now," Marcus said softly, reaching out to stroke the horse's neck. "No one's going to bother you anymore. You can just rest." Noble Spirit leaned into his touch. Marcus could have sworn the horse understood. Over the following weeks, the media storm faded. New scandals emerged, new headlines took over, but something had shifted in the royal household. There was a quiet understanding now, an unspoken acknowledgement that some things were sacred. Even in a changing world, Marcus returned to his regular duties. He stood at his post. He followed his orders. But everyone who passed him knew what he had done. Some looked at him with respect, others with resentment, but no one questioned his loyalty again. One morning, about a month after everything happened, Marcus arrived at the stable for his shift and found something unexpected. A small plaque had been mounted near Noble Spirit's stall. It was simple, elegant, clearly approved by the king himself. It read, "Noble Spirit, beloved companion of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. May he rest in peace and honor." Marcus stood there for a long moment, reading those words over and over. This was why he had taken his stand. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for this. For a small piece of dignity in a world that often forgot what mattered. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Lady Margaret approaching. She had visited the stable several times since the incident, always bringing apples for Noble Spirit, always spending a few quiet moments with the horse. "It's beautiful," she said. Looking at the plaque, "Yes, ma'am." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Lady Margaret spoke again, her voice soft. "You know, history will remember the kings and queens, the grand moments, the ceremonies. But it's people like you who preserve what really matters. The small acts of courage, the quiet stands. That's what holds a nation together." Marcus didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded. Lady Margaret smiled and walked to Noble Spirit's stall, pulling an apple from her coat pocket. The horse took it gently, and for just a moment, the stable felt peaceful. Right. But Marcus's story wasn't quite finished. 3 years passed. Noble Spirit lived peacefully in his stall at Windsor, cared for with love and respect. He was visited regularly by staff who had known the late queen, and occasionally by members of the royal family, who came to pay their respects to the memory he represented. Marcus continued his service. He was promoted to head of royal stables security, a position that came with more responsibility, but also more freedom to make decisions about how things were run. He never forgot the lesson he learned that morning in the stable, that rules were important. But principles mattered more. The younger guards looked up to him. James, who had been terrified that day, now trained new recruits and always told them the story of the guard who stood his ground. Catherine retired with honor. Marcus attended her ceremony personally. But one autumn morning, Marcus received a call that made his heart sink. It was the stable master, and his voice was heavy with sadness. "It's Noble Spirit," he said. "He's dying." Marcus dropped everything and rushed to the stable. When he arrived, he found a small group already gathered. The stable master, the head veterinarian, Lady Margaret, and, to Marcus's surprise, King Charles himself. The king stood outside the stall, his hands clasped behind his back, his face drawn. When he saw Marcus, he nodded in acknowledgement but said nothing. There was nothing to say. Inside the stall, Noble Spirit lay on his side. His breathing was labored. His eyes were half closed. The vet had already examined him and delivered the verdict. Old age had finally caught up. There was nothing to be done but make him comfortable and let him go. With dignity, Marcus entered the stall slowly and knelt beside the horse. He placed a hand on Noble Spirit's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal's coat, the slow rise and fall of his breathing. "You did good," Marcus whispered. "You were loved. You are loved, and you'll be remembered." Noble Spirit's ear twitched slightly, as if acknowledging the words. His breathing slowed further, breath more shallow than the last. Lady Margaret knelt on the other side, tears streaming down her face. "She would have wanted to be here," she said softly. "She would have held him like this." The king entered the stall then, something he rarely did. He knelt beside his mother's horse and placed his hand gently on the animal's side. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for bringing her joy, for being her friend." They stayed like that, the three of them, as Noble Spirit's breathing grew quieter and quieter. The stable was silent except for the soft sounds of the other horses shifting in their stalls, as if they too understood that something sacred was happening. And then, with one final gentle breath, Noble Spirit was gone. The silence that followed was profound. Not sad, exactly, but full, complete, like the end of a chapter that had been written with love and care. The king stood slowly, his face composed, but his eyes wet. He looked at Marcus for a long moment. "Thank you for protecting him, for giving him the last years he deserved. It was my honor, Your Majesty." The king left quietly, and the stable staff began making arrangements. Noble Spirit would be buried on the grounds of Windsor Castle, in a private ceremony attended only by those who had known and loved him. Marcus stayed in the stable. After everyone else had gone, he sat on a bench near the stall, now empty, and felt the weight of the last 3 years settle over him. He had protected this horse. He had stood against pressure and threats and the possibility of losing everything. And now the horse was gone. But as he sat there, Marcus realized something important. It had never really been about saving the horse. It had been about saving what the horse represented. Memory, respect, the idea that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible. A week later, a small stone marker was placed at Noble Spirit's grave. It was simple, elegant, and bore a single inscription, "Faithful Companion, forever remembered." Marcus visited the grave often, sometimes alone, sometimes with other guards who wanted to pay their respects. Once, he saw Queen Camilla standing there, alone, placing flowers by the stone. She didn't see him, and he didn't approach. But in that moment, he understood that she, too, had learned something from what happened. Years later, when Marcus finally retired after 25 years of service, he gave one final interview to a journalist writing a book about life in the royal household. The journalist asked him what moment defined his career. Marcus thought for a long time before answering. He could have talked about the ceremonies he'd attended, the dignitaries he'd protected, the decades of flawless service. But instead, he spoke about one morning in a stable when he chose to say no. "I learned that duty isn't just about following orders," Marcus said. "It's about knowing when to stand up for something bigger than yourself, even if you stand alone, especially if you stand alone." The journalist asked if he had any regrets. Marcus smiled. Not one. And as he left the palace grounds for the last time, walking past the stables where it all began, he felt at peace. He had served with honor. He had protected something precious. And in the end, that was all that mattered. In the stable, a new generation of horses stood in their stalls. New guards walked the grounds. New stories were being written. But on quiet mornings, when the mist hung low and the world was still, those who knew the story said they could sometimes hear the soft sound of hoofbeats echoing through the yard. Noble's spirit's story had ended. But the lesson he taught about courage, about memory, about standing for what's right, would live on forever, and somewhere. Perhaps the late queen smiled, knowing that her beloved horse and the guard who protected him had both done their duty until the very end.